If you love data and tables and charts, enjoy, but it's not going to help you make money. Now, the curious thing is the best ones did, well, the best ones from the first 5 years, the next 5 years returned 56, and the worst ones returned 61. But what did the market do? The total market return was 77. Well, not the total market, the S&P 500. So in both cases, if you picked the worst or the best, you underperformed the market, or the S&P 500. So you could have done 56 or 61, or you could have just bought the freaking index and made 77%. Matter of fact, for the 5-year period ending 12/31 of 15 from this little data set that I built, only 58 of these 757 funds beat the S&P 500. That's 7.7%. And the problem is that you have no possible way to know in advance where that 7% is going to be. Now, can someone else as an advisor show you a list of funds that did beat the market over the last 5 years? Absolutely. There's 58 of them just in this little category that I created. There's others that might have beat it because maybe they had more of something else, or more small cap, or a big stock that happened to win. It doesn't provide predictive value for the future. So that's a little bit of information about how stock mutual funds perform in the past and how the data is not helpful. One of the reasons why I say over and over and over, mutual fund or index funds, index funds, index funds, index funds. In this example, in just 5 years, you would have beat 93% of all large blended mutual funds by just being in the S&P 500. You're not going to beat everybody, but you're only going to beat 93% of the people. Now, when you carry that out 10 years, you beat a larger portion. I don't want to make the absolute most money of anybody out there, but if I can make more than 95 to 96 to 98% of other people, I'm pretty freaking happy with that. That's fine. Anyway, that's going to ramp up the section. We're going to take a little break, and then we're going to go into our interview, and I'll talk to you on the other side. This is Phil Ferguson with Polaris Financial Planning, the home of science-based investing. I see people owning really bad investments all of the time. Many advisors are paid a commission by a big company to sell you something you may not need. It's kind of like church. They create fear, then they tell you what you want to hear, and then they take your money. What you want is an advisor that is paid only by you. That is a fee-only fiduciary advisor. Remember, people work for who they are paid by. You can contact me, Phil, at PolarisFinancialPlanning.com, or listen to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. Each show, we have an interesting investing skeptically topic and an interview with someone fighting to end religion. Polaris also gives 10% of gross revenue to support the growing secular movement. You're not just getting better investments, you're helping to change the world. All right, everybody, welcome back. This is, of course, still the Phil Ferguson Show. And I have with me the author of a delightful book. His name is Robert H. Frank. Now, you got to keep the H in there because it's important to find the guy. And, of course, the book is called Success and Luck. Robert, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing very well, Phil. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I actually heard you on the Bob Brinker podcast.
I am.
And it was funny because in the very beginning of your book, which is not something I normally see with a book, you had to defend your subtitle, and it almost seemed like it would be unnecessary, but after hearing the real-time response of callers on the Bob Brinker Show,
yes,
it became very clear. And for the listeners, if you don't know this yet, of course, the subtitle is Good Fortune and the Myth of Meritocracy. And it was one of those things that with this idea of luck, and I got this impression from the listeners of the Bob Brinker Show, and he runs a little bit on the conservative side, where my listeners are probably a little bit, if not wildly, on the liberal side. Just because you're saying that luck is important, it doesn't mean that there's a dichotomy, that it's either all luck or all skill. Does that sound right? Am I summarizing this idea?
I think the main problem people have when they hear about the book secondhand is that they think my message is that success is explained mostly by luck. That is absolutely not my message. The people who succeed in big ways are typically very hardworking. They're very talented. The point of the book really is that very few people succeed on a grand scale without those qualities, but fewer still succeed if they didn't enjoy at least a modicum of good fortune along their path to the top. So good luck is certainly not sufficient for success, but there are very few people who succeed without at least a little bit of it.
I had a friend of mine who had a nice job. He was making over $200,000 a year, and he has attributed all of that to his hard work and his effort. And it was all him, and why should the government take his money? Because of all the work that he did. And I asked him, where did he grow up? And he grew up in a very wealthy and affluent neighborhood in the northern suburbs of Chicago, had wonderful parents that had great money. They paid for him to go to a private school. They paid 100% of his bill to go to a fancy college, and got into a job training program and a management training program. And sure, he worked hard, but as you point out in your book, a lot of people work hard that don't end up with great success.
Ask him how he thinks things would have worked out for him if he'd been born in South Sudan.
Absolutely. Or if I can get a little bit political here, even if he was born as an African-American in the United States.
Exactly. If you're in a gang-infested neighborhood, your parents don't have steady work, you're starting out with a very severe handicap.
And, of course, there are people who start with these terrible environments and do really, really well. And, of course, there's people like Donald Trump who start out with a fortune and somehow scrap together enough and file enough bankruptcies to maintain a small fortune despite what he claims to have as a large fortune. So it can go either way.
Exactly.
So you also had looked at some research that had people that have great skill and do great work and make great efforts, but luck plays into that. How did you calculate that? How does that work out?
Oh, I mean, a lot of it is just looking at the stories of individually successful people. There are vivid illustrations of how people have succeeded on a grand scale and would not have done so but for specific breaks they had along the way. But to make the point more generally, it's useful to look at simulation results. You can set up a mathematical model of a tournament, just like a foot race. The fastest runner wins the race. Speed is 98% talent and 2% luck in the simulation I've run many times. And if you have enough contestants in the race, then it's clear that many of them are going to be near the top of the talent scale. Find the best one. There'll be one among the thousands of contestants who's faster than anybody in terms of talent. That person is going to be neither lucky nor unlucky on average. He's just chosen specifically because he had the most talent. There will be others in the contestant pool, maybe even scores or hundreds of them, who are almost as talented as he was. Some of them are going to have been extremely lucky as well. So if luck counts even for just 2% of the total, one of those people who's almost as talented but much more lucky is going to win that race. So, yeah, that's the bottom line of the narrative. To flesh it out with a concrete example, I like the case history of Bryan Cranston. I don't know if you're a Breaking Bad fan.
Indeed. I quite enjoyed the show. Almost it kind of got in my head and messed me up a little bit because it was so good.
It's dark. I wanted to call it perhaps the greatest TV series of all times. My editor didn't like that. We compromised and called it one of the greatest TV series of all times. But Vince Gilligan, the producer and writer, wanted to cast Bryan Cranston as the Walter White role. He had seen him in an X-Files episode 20 or 30 years ago and thought he was the right guy for the part. The studio bosses didn't want to hear about that. They wanted somebody well-known. It was going to be an expensive project, and so they offered the role to Matthew Broderick. Broderick said no. They offered the role to John Cusack. Cusack said no. I'm guessing those two are kicking themselves right now, thinking back to the possibility that they could have been Walter White. Finally, he persuaded the money guys to go with Cranston. And look, Cranston was a journeyman at that point. He was a middle-aged guy, best known for his role in Malcolm in the Middle. He was the dad on that show. I never even saw that show. I'd never heard of him before. He won 4 Emmys in the show's 5 seasons. He's now the most sought-after actor in his slice of the demographic. So he'll be the first to admit that if you don't have a little luck along the way, you're not going to make it. There are so many people who are as talented as he are who will never break out. He broke out, and he knows he was lucky to break out, but that doesn't take one bit away from the praise he deserves for the hard work and the talent he brings to the picture. Well,
I know it's rare for me to do this. I'm going to make a sports analogy for my listeners. They're going to be a little bit in shock because I'm not a sports ball kind of person. We also acknowledge there's a little bit of luck involved in the most highest levels of professional sports because the tournaments and the playoffs and not the Super Bowl because it's one game, but everything else like the World Series and the Stanley Cup thing, it's not one game. It's a best of 3 or 5 or 7 because at some point, and one could argue maybe that they just want to make more money, but any one game could have a little bit of luck that helps one team win over another. So you have to really have multiple plays to have a better chance of knowing who is the better team.
Yeah, and that's why the team with the best record in baseball is probably the best team, but is not likely to win the World Series in any given year, just because of the random events that play into even a 7-game series.
Absolutely, and for a totally randomly different subject, one of the ones that you mentioned, and I loved it, so I was hoping you can do it off the top of your head, and I'll help you if you get stuck, but the Mona Lisa. You mentioned this in your book.
Yeah, that's another great story of how external events play into our assessments of things. I owe this story really to Duncan Watts, the sociologist. I'll recommend his book strongly. It's called Everything is Obvious, and then there's an asterisk after the title, and the asterisk down below says, once you know the answer. So it's a marvelous set of illustrations of the concept of hindsight bias. We see an outcome, and we try to explain it, and we look to all the usual plausible explanations for it. So he was at the Louvre on a visit. He was, like most of us who've been there, crowded in with hundreds of others trying to get a closer look at the Mona Lisa. It's a very small painting. You're surprised when you see it for the first time.
Yes, it is.
It's completely unremarkable, at least it was to my eye, and that was his reaction to it too. And what really struck him was that in the adjacent gallery, there are 2 other Leonardos from the same period. They use the same novel brushstrokes as in the Mona Lisa. Nobody's crowded around trying to get a closer look at them. Why not? So he did a little digging, and he discovered that the Mona Lisa itself had been very little remarked upon for most of its early history. Hundreds of years went by. It wasn't special in any obvious way. Then, one evening in 1911, Vincenzo Perugia, an Italian maintenance worker at the Louvre, stole the painting. He put it under his cloak and walked out with it one night. It was the first time it had ever happened, but the theft received round-the-world coverage in the world's newspapers. They were able to run pictures of the painting. That had never been technically possible before then. And so it was a huge explosion of publicity about the painting. It went on. The crime was unsolved for 2 years. Finally, they apprehended him 2 years later. He was trying to sell the painting to the Uffizi in Florence. And then there's another explosion of publicity. Copies of the painting reproduced in newspapers around the world. And except for the fact that it was stolen, we would never, any of us, except the really learned art historians, have ever heard of the Mona Lisa. And that's not the way people think about it. People think, well, it's the most famous painting in the world. It must have